Oh, I have an appetite for background checks. We're going to be doing background checks. We're working with Democrats. We're working with Republicans. We already have very strong background checks.
President Trump also spoke about his conversation with NRA Chief Executive Wayne LaPierre. That was yesterday. The president denied recent reporting that he told LaPierre he would not pursue background checks and later added this.
We have background checks, but there are loopholes in the background checks. And that's what I spoke to the NRA about yesterday. They want to get rid of the loopholes as well as I do. At the same time, I don't want to take away people's Second Amendment rights. I don't want to take away the Constitution having to do with gun ownership. And, you know, we can't let that slope go so easy that we're talking about background checks, then all of a sudden we're talking about let's take everybody's gun away. People need weapons, unfortunately, for protection.
So that word slope, that is an NRA talking point.
No, it's a Trump talking point.
Politico reports that Senate Homeland Security Chairman Republican Ron Johnson is casting major doubt on the prospects of significant gun regulations passing this fall. And we quote, the Wisconsin Republican said that a background checks measure based on the bill written by Senators Pat Toomey and Joe Manchin and a national red flag bill are both unlikely to pass. He was open to GOP Senator Lindsey Graham's bill that would establish a red flag grant program, but said the Senate would need to attach to those grants very strict guidelines in terms of due process. Back with us tonight, two former members of Congress. Donna Edwards, former Democratic member from the great state of Maryland, who is these days a Washington Post columnist, and David Jolly, former Republican member of Congress from the great state of Florida, who has since left the Republican Party. Good evening to you both. Congresswoman, I would like to begin with you. Phil Bump over at the Washington Post did a study of the limits of our concern, the end date of our concern over things like mass shootings. Here it is. Our analysis of the aftermath of recent high-profile mass shootings suggests that interest in addressing the problem tapers out after about 3 weeks, or this week, relative to the massacre in El Paso. As much as it crushes my soul to admit this about the country we've become, that feels about right, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and it feels like what has happened is that there are so many of these mass shootings. Americans have become so accustomed to the Congress and political leaders not really dealing with them at all in a meaningful way that we've almost become numb to them. I mean, it's difficult to say, but we have to recognize that. And after all, look at what the president just did. Talk about slippery slope. He went from one flip-flop to the next flip-flop to the next one. In the span of just a few days, holding an infant who had lost the child's parents and taking a photo opportunity, but now not willing to do something that could have made a difference in that child's life.
All of it as we watched in real time. Congressman, I want to know how moderate Republicans get elected on no action on guns. Yeah, we just decided to take a pass on guns. How does Susan Collins get reelected to the Senate from Maine, a confusing state politically, but it looks like there's going to be no output?
I think it goes to Philip Bump's analysis that they waited out, that the attention span of the nation moves on, which is why there's a cry for political leadership, dramatic leadership, not just demand for legislation that incrementally addresses this like we're talking about right now, but political leadership that fundamentally changes the conversation of guns in the country, that political leadership that can say to gun owners, lawful gun owners, we're not going to take your guns. You can still purchase guns, but this culture of guns on demand will change. It may take you 2, 4, 6 weeks to legally purchase a gun in the United States because we're going to have universal background checks, further than what the House wants to do. Even among friends and family, they're going to be checked. Checks are going to be comprehensive, not just criminal prosecutions, but the criminal encounters that don't lead to prosecution, domestic violence calls where a spouse doesn't file charges. Background checks are going to include mental health evaluations. We're going to either ban assault weapons or make them so difficult to get they're functionally obsolete. We're going to ban high-capacity magazines, and we're going to have zero enforcement. As easy as it was to put marijuana offenders in jail, so will it be easy to put gun offenders in jail. And for people who think that's radical, I would point to what Florida did after Parkland. The debate around arming teachers was a controversial one, but here's what they did. They said if we're going to arm educators, they will be required to have 144 hours of training, a psychiatric evaluation, and a drug test. So if Republicans in Florida think that those background checks and requirements are so critical for somebody to carry a weapon around children on a school campus, why not the same requirements to carry a gun around kids at a Walmart in El Paso, or attendees at a garlic festival in California, or a nightclub in Orlando, or a restaurant district in Dayton? We've got to fundamentally crush this culture of guns on demand. That takes urgency of political leadership. Without it, moderate Republicans and those who do nothing will continue to be reelected.
The gentleman from Florida makes a very convincing argument, yet this is what the gentlelady from NBC News writes, our own Shannon Pettypiece. A senior administration official cautioned that the messaging will most likely continue to be messy and confusing as Trump continues to search for a position to settle on. And this is what you were just saying, Congresswoman.
Well,
we've watched it move.
Well, exactly. And what position is there to settle on? I mean, in this country, 9 out of 10 Americans believe that there should be universal background checks. An overwhelming majority believe that we should ban high-capacity magazines. An overwhelming majority believe that we should place limits on assault rifles. And so if the president is searching for a position, he just needs to go to where the American people are. And instead, he's the push-me, pull-you of the National Rifle Association. And I have to tell you, the proposal that was released just today from the Parkland students is really bold, and it's an action plan, and it's also an electoral plan. It's saying, you know what? You're not going to change the law. We're not talking about that anymore. We're going to get rid of you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.